Good afternoon, members. Good afternoon, ladies and gents. A very warm welcome to the Planning Committee meeting today. I hope everybody's sufficiently warm and comfortable. I've been advised that the only fan in the building is keeping the lawyer and the planning officers cool. As when we met last time, it was unbearably hot also, so please feel free to absent oneself from the chamber if you need to cool down. Thank you very much. Turning to today's agenda, very warm welcome. I think we have the same members who were here previously. Democratic support. Do we have any apologies received?
We've had apologies from Councillor Stoneman, and Councillor Mrs Pengelly is substituting today.
Thank you. Welcome, Councillor Pengelly. Item number 2, any declarations of interest. I assume the forms have been passed up. Are there any declarations of interest in respect to the planning items on the agenda, please, members? That's noted. No declarations. Thank you. Item number 3, the minutes of the last meeting held on the 23rd of June. Members, do you have any comments in respect of those minutes? There's one amendment that needs to be made in relation to item number 7.4. That's the Chelsham Meadow voting record on page 5 of your bundles. It shows Councillor Nicholson as being absent, but it also shows him as voting. He can't do both. He was absent. And the minutes will be, well, you've been called many things. We'll go with unique, but the minutes will be amended to show that he was absent, that he didn't vote. Members, are there any other amendments to note? In the absence of that, I'll sign those as an accurate reflection subject to that amendment after today's meeting. Item number 4, Chair's urgent business. I'm not apprised of any urgent business. Item number 5, questions from member of the public. Again, I've not been supplied with any questions for today's meeting. That takes us straight into item number 6.1, which is a matter that we discussed at considerable length when we last met. This was adjourned for the local authority to make further inquiries. Emily, I believe you're going to take us through this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So this item relates to the application at 58 Devonport Road, which was heard and subsequently deferred at the June Planning Committee. To remind members, this is a retrospective application for the alteration of the shopfront, following the granted consent for a change of use to a hot food takeaway in 2020. As mentioned at the previous committee meeting, the main concerns related to this application are regarding the loss of the postbox. The application was deferred to allow time for the lead officer to contact Royal Mail and confirm their position regarding the provision of a replacement postbox in Stoke Village. A response was received from Royal Mail, which confirmed that they will endeavour to install a new postbox. Notwithstanding this, the application has been assessed according to the relevant material planning considerations. Again, here are the plans received as part of the application, which detail the removal of the postbox and the replacement glass panel. As said in the previous committee meeting, the design of the shopfront has not been altered, and the works consist of a like-for-like replacement of the glass panel. The proposal has been considered by officers to be acceptable. Consultation with the Historic Environment Officer has confirmed that the postbox was not of significant heritage value, that it should be retained on these grounds. And here is the letter that was received from Royal Mail detailing the provision of a new postbox. This is proposed to be located close to the location of the original, but not within the shopfront of 58 Devonport Road. It details in the letter that it is estimated to be installed in the next 12 to 16 weeks. Overall, it is the view of the local planning authority that the retrospective proposal still accords with the policies protecting visual impact, amenity, and the historic environment, and therefore the application remains recommended to be granted conditionally. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Emily. I understand we have one speaker registered at Councillor Creswell. And your prop? Super. Thank you. Councillor Creswell, as you know, you have 5 minutes to speak. Would you like a 1-minute warning? We'll throw it out there just in case.
Possibly, I don't think I will be speaking for that long. I'm not planning to speak for a long time.
Thank you. So when you're ready.
Thank you very much. Right, thank you, Chair of Planning, Planning Committee, and all of the members present for having me and my postbox back for a second time to speak yet again on the subject of Stoke Postbox. I will try to be brief, as I have already set out the case for rejecting the retrospective planning for 58 Devonport Road, which I and others explained at the last planning meeting. Members are all well aware that by rejecting the retrospective planning, Royal Mail will put a postbox back into Stoke Village at no cost to the council and no cost to the business. And as I said before, basically it's a win-win for everyone concerned. Very simple and very straightforward. So in good faith and fairness and openness, I did send out a copy of the letter from Mr. Michael Hogg, which was to Stuart Wingfield, and copied into myself and Councillors Lang, Briars Delve and Luke Pollard MP. And I sent it out to all members of this committee, so as to keep you up to date and to keep you in the loop. So I was therefore a little surprised when one member of the committee seemed to want to make it a bit of a party political capital out of it, something which this committee has to be very much above. However, I actually put this down to a bit of lack of experience rather than any mischief, so there's a little lesson learnt there, I trust. The letter you have all seen now, and is on screen, from Michael Hogg, who is the Senior Public Affairs Manager at Royal Mail, confirms that Royal Mail will endeavour to install the postbox in the village within 12 to 16 weeks. Mr. Hogg has already given this assurance and promise to Luke Pollard on more than one occasion. This assurance had been passed on to myself and also my ward colleagues, Jemima Lang and Councillor Briars Delve, where we had been firmly told that a postbox would be put back into Stoke Village, given that the original one had been removed without planning permission or permission from Royal Mail. And I did try to make this very clear at the last planning meeting. I think there's another important lesson here as well, and that's one of trust in someone's word. Mr. Hogg is a public servant, and we can and should trust these people. They are honest, and they are open, and they tell the truth, and there was no reason not to believe what was being said. It's perhaps a sad reflection and a real consequence of some of our present ills in political life. Had there been trust in what I had been saying and reporting 4 weeks ago, we'd actually be 4 weeks further down the line. We would have been looking at a postbox being installed within 8 to 12 weeks, and you wouldn't have to put up listening to me going on and on again. Definitely a bonus. However, we are where we are, and upwards and onwards. So my last plea is as it was 4 weeks ago. If localism means anything, it shouldn't mean that a landlord or anyone can remove a postbox and so deprive a community of its local amenities. In this case, the right to post letters. The council cannot afford to set a precedent here. Basically, if it does, we are on a very slippery slope to ruin, and bad behaviour and lack of adherence to the rules is rewarded. I therefore implore the committee to please reject the retrospective planning for our community to have our postbox back, not this one I hasten to add, and that now rests entirely on your shoulders. I hope and trust that the planning committee will make the right decisions in the interests of the local Stoke community. And I can only say thank you very much, Chair and committee, for having me back yet again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Creswell. I'd like to before I invite members to contribute to this, respond particularly to Councillor Creswell. I can assure you as chair, and I appreciate this is my second meeting of the Planning Committee in this administrative year, but there is no place for politics in this committee. I think every member subscribes to that thought process. We're dealing with very important matters that affects the lives of many, and long after we have left this city through choice or otherwise. There is no place for politics in these discussions, and as chair, should I detect that, taking your point on board, Councillor Creswell, I would welcome members to stamp that out also, because this is about planning, this is about making decisions that affects the landscape of our city. It's not about political parties. I accept that we're all elected members of political parties and we can differ on many things, but here deciding planning applications and the merits of those applications, not our political persuasions. I will indulge comments about politics, but there is no place for it. Turning to the comment about Councillor Finn, that's already been determined by the legal officer, and we need not discuss that any further. A communication to all panel members was sent out with the decision on that matter. Members, would anybody like to discuss this matter? Councillor Nicholson and Councillor Stevens.
Chair, thank you very much. And first, I'll wholly endorse your comments. I think this whole thing, to be honest, has been a political stunt on the part of members for Stoke, irrespective of their political party, to effectively bring an issue about a postbox, important though it is, and try to use an application by a local business and muddy the water like members have for Stoke, and had a long-standing campaign that's been in the media with the local member of parliament, actually shows a certain amount, Chair, through you, ineffectual representation by members of that area. You shouldn't need to be using a shopfront planning application to try and sort out a postbox, a vital postbox for a community. And that's what we've seen, and that's very disappointing to see. And I hope Councillor Creswell, who, you know, is long-standing participant of local politics, but has only been on the council a couple of years, it's not, sadly, I'll respectfully say, a good note to bring a prop and use this committee in the manner that you and your colleagues have done over this particular planning application. I've not seen it, I don't think I've ever seen it before. This is the first time that you've openly challenged the planning committee to make inappropriate decisions around a planning application on a shop front for political purposes. I think it's disgraceful.
Councillor Nicholson, so I've just made a grand speech about not allowing politics.
Well,
I'm not going to allow politics.
No,
so could you make a point on the amendment that we're here to discuss?
I'll just make the point that the report that's been very ably put together by the officer, I think, merits support now, and I think we should get on and approve the changes to the shop front in this particular premises. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Stevens.
Thanks. I'm glad that your plea to keep partisan comments away from this committee lasted all of 30 seconds. I'll certainly not go down that route either by email or verbal comments today. I'm pleased to see the officers did what the majority of the committee asked them to do last time. That's clear. But I'll come back to, again, a comment of yours that you made a couple of minutes ago, Chair. This is about planning, and the letter that the exchange of letters that we see hasn't moved us in either direction on the planning merits. I was ready to vote against this last time. I always listen to comments that colleagues and officers and public speakers make. I totally see where the case officer is coming from, in as much as the planning merits haven't changed. We've heard an interesting comment from the Royal Mail, and that's very interesting, and no doubt will be of great interest to people in Stoke. But my view on the planning merits haven't changed because the planning situation hasn't changed. We've heard nothing new, and that's, please don't take that as a criticism, it's a matter of fact. Nothing has changed. Normally we defer to go away and look at planning issues. We didn't do that on this occasion. We deferred to look at something of interest to people in Stoke. So the planning committee was being used to look at interesting issues in Stoke by those who moved the deferment. I'm of a mind to still vote against, which is where I was 4 weeks ago, Chair, for the reasons that I set out when we almost got to the vote last time. Nothing has changed planning-wise in my estimation from there on in.
Thank you, Councillor Stevens. I have Councillor Smith.
Thank you, Chair. I obviously wasn't here for the debate last time, so I'm just slightly confused by the assertion that it needs to still be refused when it feels like the answer that the Speaker was looking for has been resolved, which is that you're getting the post box, but we're also getting, according to the officer's response, a like-for-like shopfront minus this post box that's obviously not been used for a very long time, and a smart shopfront in the midst of Stoke Village. So I'm very confused as to why the ward councillor still wants us to refuse it when they're getting both a post box but also a shop that is going to add an asset to the community. So for me, I as somebody who's just come into this debate, I think, to me, from what the officer said and reading the letter, reading the papers, it seems a pretty cut and dried approval to me, but I might be wrong on that. So if Emily or you, Chair, have got any comments on that, I'd be open to them. But as far as I'm seeing, coming in fresh, I don't really see what the problem is.
It's not for Emily to comment on what the councillor thinks. It's not Emily's place to do that. Emily's putting forward the plan, but I note your comments. Councillor Finn.
Yeah, I think any decision to not grant this is almost anti-business. If we look at page 11, 8.45, it is understood, and I read verbatim, it is understood by officers that whilst a replacement post box within Stoke Village was requested, Royal Mail declined the request due to there being 5 post boxes within X area. If we go to 8.44, the post box was not in use at the time of its removal and therefore be required to be removed from the premises, irrespective of any decision that we make here. So I think we need to look at it on the merits of a business, a sustainable business. Now we know that the post box issue has been set aside, and therefore I think that the recommendations of the officers are the correct one in this case. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not noticing any more hands up on that. I note your comments, Councillor Finn, from the officer's report. So members, we will be going to the vote shortly, but we were at quite a unique position, which Councillor Stevens touched off in his representations, where the local authority were tasked to make those inquiries. When Councillor Creswell spoke at the last meeting for the benefit of Councillor Smith, there was also another speaker on behalf of the public, and representations were made in respect of that to reject the application was the only way that the post box would be reinstated. And having revisited the meeting a couple of times, I re-watched it a few times just to make sure that I understood that properly, and that's exactly what was being advanced. But I'm grateful for Councillor Creswell, who clarified that in her representations today. But we took the opportunity as a local authority to make those inquiries, to make sure, acting in the best interests of the residents in Stoke, as was being advanced by the ward councillor, that if we could help the provision of a post box, it would be a unique opportunity to do so whilst the local authority was considering this planning application. And that's why it was amended, moved by Councillor Nicholson. And it has reaped a reward. As a result, we've had the confirmation from the Royal Mail. But as Councillor Stevens rightly points out, we are to decide the merits of this application, and that's what's been asked of you today. So the recommendation from the officer is to grant conditionally in accordance with the papers. Members, if you would vote in accordance with your panels on that, please. Members, that is passed 9-4, no abstentions, 4 against. Thank you very much. Agenda item 6.2, 8 Napier Street. Over to you again, Emily.
Thank you, Chair. This item relates to the application at 8 Napier Street. The property is a mid-terrace dwelling house located in the Stoke ward and within the Stoke Conservation Area. The properties along Napier Street are characterised by large 2-storey rear tenements. From this satellite view of the property, you can see the rear garden, which is situated between the 2 tenements of 7 and 8 Napier Street. Here are some photos from the site which show where the rear extension is proposed to be constructed. So here are the existing plans. So you can see the existing rear courtyard at the moment. And here are the proposed. The application is for a single-storey rear extension. The extension will be approximately 7 metres deep and 3 metres wide. It will have a flat roof with an eaves height of 3 metres, as well as a roof lantern, making the highest point of the roof 3.7 metres in height. The materials proposed are for the extension to be finished in render to match the existing property and for the use of aluminium windows and doors. Officers consider these materials are a positive inclusion in terms of visual impact and of a good quality to be cohesive with the conservation area. The rear extension is considered to not be largely visible from any public vantage points, given the works will be entirely to the rear of the property. Officers also consider that the extension will be screened by the 2 tenements that it will be sandwiched between, as well as by the rear boundary wall. The rear tenement at 7 Napier Street is not served by any side elevation windows, and so officers do not consider that there would be any amenity impact for neighbours in terms of the loss of outlook, daylight or privacy. The site is located, as I mentioned earlier, within the Stoke Conservation Area, and some concerns were raised in submitted letters of representation regarding the impact on the historic environment. Historic environment officers consulted on the application and raised no concerns to the proposals, and therefore officers consider the works are acceptable on these grounds. Some letters of representation raised concerns relating to how the development relates to the boundary line shared between 7 and 8 Napier Street. These concerns included the ventilation of the property, the construction of the extension, and how repairs would be carried out to the application property and the neighbouring property. Whilst officers note these concerns, they relate to building regulations and party wall obligations, both of which are not material planning considerations. Building regulations procedures are a separate process to the planning system, which involves the assessment of the works in accordance with Building Regulations 2010. This is the next process that an applicant must enter into following the granting of planning permission. As such, an assessment of these matters cannot be undertaken by the local planning authority. Furthermore, the Party Wall Act 1996 is also not a material planning consideration and is instead a civil matter. The process is a legal requirement which the owner of the property must undertake. Therefore, the local planning authority are able to grant planning permission, but works cannot commence until a party award is agreed between neighbours. Party wall agreements are necessary either where there is a shared boundary wall or works will take place up to the boundary line of the property. In this case, the works are proposed to take place up to the boundary line, which is marked by the neighbouring tenement, and so would require an agreement with the adjoining neighbour prior to the commencement of works. However, reaching a party wall agreement is not a part of the planning process. To this end, gaining planning permission or complying with building regulations does not remove the need to comply with the Party Wall Act. For these reasons, officers have assessed the scheme on its planning merit and find that the proposal accords with policies protecting the visual impact, amenity, and the historic environment, and therefore officers recommend the application for conditional approval. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Emily. We have 2 speakers. Councillor Lang, you're registered first. Would you like to take your usual spot in this chamber, actually, isn't it? Councillor, would you like, you have 5 minutes, would you like a 1-minute warning? Thank you. Go ahead, thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the chance to speak on this application. Napier Street is a really friendly street in Stoke Ward, and I know the residents on whose behalf I called this application before the Planning Committee want it to continue that way. But they do have concerns about this application and wanted those aired in this forum, so that's why I'm here. The kind of extension you're looking at has not been attempted by any property in this street of large Georgian houses, so it isn't possible to see an example of how an extension like this would affect a neighbouring property over time. And that is where the residents I am speaking for's concerns arise. This isn't about concerns around daylight or privacy. The proposed development drawings show no clear indication as to how the new extension will join with the neighbouring wall, or any consideration as to the impact of this on existing foundations. There are also currently 5 air vents which help to ventilate a suspended, joisted timber floor to eliminate dry rot. The design of the new extension and the architect's statement show no consideration as to how the party wall will include the required space for airflow for these vents and how that will be dealt with. This is a particular concern because the old tenement foundation will not be as deep as the new boot-shaped foundation required by the new building regulations for the new build. Sharing a party wall will impact the building by increasing weight, which it cannot sustain. Sharing in combination with the new deeper foundations necessary for the new build, this is likely to perhaps cause sagging, cracking in the wall, and a risk of collapse. It also creates a problem of access, should the residents need to access their render to do periodic work or guttering. Access via number 8 is how that is done currently. If the proposal is for a very small gap, which doesn't actually touch the wall between the properties, this also causes concern, as it may well prove attractive an area for vermin to take up residence. As I say, this kind of extension hasn't been attempted in the street before. So there are also concerns around the practicality of carrying out this kind of work, as the rear service lane is very, very narrow compared to the average service lane in the city, and it's not accessible by vehicles. And I've also been asked to include concerns from another neighbour about the impact on the very old walls, and that neighbour's belief that this is just not in keeping with the conservation area. The poet Robert Frost wrote more than 100 years ago that good fences make good neighbours. It might be time to update that poem for the 21st century, that actually it's good extensions that make good neighbours. And the residents I'm here speaking for don't believe what is proposed here in its current form is a good extension, and would ask you to refuse permission, or failing that the width of the extension be reduced so it is further from the neighbouring property. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Mr. Richard Atkinson, would you like to come down where Councillor Lang was just a moment ago? So you have 5 minutes to speak. Would you like a 1-minute warning? Thank you. If you press the button on the mic there, and the floor is yours. Sorry, just bear with me a second.
I think the speaker had something to put up on the screen. We just need to find it.
Thank you. If you would just mind holding on a moment. Yeah, we're just making arrangements for that. If you just stay there a moment. Thank you. Members, I believe the speaker has a slide he wishes to show. That's going to be put on the screen.
Chair, while we've got a minute, could we ask in future that the speakers list be circulated, please? Because generally that always came out and sort of normally with an addendum, so there clearly isn't any addendum, but we didn't get a speakers list.
I'll make that happen. I was expecting to be admonished from Councillor Stevens, so it's nice to be admonished this time from you. I'll get this right eventually, I promise.
I was going to congratulate you on not circulating it, but obviously Patrick's got a different view.
The slide, that's the slide you hope to refer to, is that right? I don't know. Do we have that capability? Okay, so if you push the button to activate the light on your mic, and you have 5 minutes, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I am Richard Atkinson of Atkinson Architects and have been appointed by the owner of number 7 Napier Street, Dr. Sana Marani, to speak on their behalf. We object to the extent of the proposed extension and fact that it would physically interfere with the historic wall belonging to the house at number 7. We did not object to the principle of an extension. Atkinson Architects are specialist conservation architects and have worked on dozens of buildings in the Stoke conservation area over the past 20 years. We have a very thorough knowledge of how the Napier Street terrace of houses were built for the St Aubin estate during the 1840 to 1860 period. They are very solid, well-built Victorian townhouses, constructed from local shillet, but with very shallow, flared foundations, generally only a few inches below ground level. This is a very important principle that the historic environment planning officers within your department should have been aware of and included in their assessment. The wall, which the proposed extension abuts, is not a shared party wall or a garden wall. It is the 2-storey tenement boundary to the house of number 7. This is evidenced in the owner's deeds and shown clearly on the diagram. There are 3 key reasons, as illustrated, for our objection based on unacceptable and unnecessary risk. It was interesting for Emily to distinguish between the planning aspects and those which are party wall and building regulations related, but the advice from the historic environment officers, I think, seriously compromises that position. Firstly, item 1, the extension wall and foundations would encroach on the foundations of number 7. Current building regulations would demand that the new excavations, insulated slab and floor structure go much further down than the existing flared foundation of 7. This would generate an underpinning requirement, which is a very serious condition. Secondly, there is a regular line of air bricks at the foot of the wall that allow essential cross-ventilation to the floor void of the kitchen at number 7. These would inevitably be blocked up by the proposed extension. The floor is a traditional joist and floorboard type, and the void must be maintained in order to eliminate the risk of dry rot. Over recent years, we have inspected several houses in the vicinity where timber decay has been caused by blocked air bricks. Thirdly, at roof level, the only way to create a weatherproof connection would be to cut or grind into the wall of number 7 and fix lead flashings. This would then be a weak spot along the length of the neighbour's wall with a potential for rainwater ingress and damp problems. In conclusion, underpinning the potential for timber decay and rainwater damp problems are significant and wholly unacceptable risks that the owners of number 7 would be subject to should this application be approved. We genuinely believe these principles have not been fully understood by the planning officer. The situation is fundamentally different to a full-width rear extension that spans between 2 garden boundary walls. This is the house wall defining the kitchen and bedrooms at number 7. All we are requesting is that the extension be pulled back away from the number 7 boundary wall to eliminate these concerns and maintain the integrity of the 2-storey tenement building. We therefore ask members of the committee to consider this request seriously and either refuse the application on its current merits or at least return to the applicants and ask them to just pull the thing back slightly. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. If you'd like to return to your seat at the back of the chamber, thank you very much. Members, would you like to contribute to the debate before the officer responds? Thank you. Councillor Partridge.
After hearing from the rather learned public speaker and having some knowledge of buildings myself, I think it's a rather reasonable request to add a condition that pulls what is currently in that image abutting extension to the existing number 7 tenement by pulling it away from that wall by a determined distance, so it's not interfering with the air bricks, with the shallow footings or foundations. And given the fact that it is a conservation area, that these houses are very old, they deserve some respect if we're to keep them for another 100 years. Thank you, Chair.
If you're proposing to put an amendment or a motion forward, perhaps you might want to formulate that in your mind and give it some thought as the debate continues, and then we can come back to you if you want to put a motion and amendment before you invite somebody to second that, so we're clear on what you're actually seeking. Thank you. Councillor Stevens.
Yeah, thanks. Although the speaker clearly spoke with a lot of knowledge, and I hear Councillor Barcher's comments too, I'm just wondering if Stuart or Emily could just take us through again, where planning stops and building regulations begin, because I think, although there was quite a lot of sense spoken, I did sense that we weren't talking specifically about planning issues. I don't know which way I'm going on this one yet, but I did sense that what the councillor was proposing, whilst logical, did stray well away from planning consideration. So I'd be great. I'm sure the committee would be grateful if we could have some clarity from our officers on that, please.
Thank you, Councillor Stevens. I did want to inject some debate after the public speakers before we did that, but it seems like an appropriate point to pause. Either Stuart or Emily, the public speaker, Mr. Atkinson, raised 3 issues, namely underpinning requirements, the void being blocked, and grinding out to prevent the weak spot. And equally, Councillor Lang talked about the development being very much unprecedented, and also raised issues about what the work plan might look like, how the build was going to be facilitated. We'll pause the debate there. Could you perhaps address those points?
So for the purposes of planning, we don't review detailed construction drawings. It's not required for a planning application. So the drawings that Emily has shared are the only drawings that we have for the application, which don't have any of the construction details in it. So we can't advise the committee how the building will be constructed. It would be for the building regulations stage to kind of determine that. So we do need to steer clear of making a decision based on something covered under the Building Act rather than the Planning Act. I think there was a second question.
And just to confirm, that happened after the planning stage as opposed to at the planning stage, is that correct?
Yeah, there's no requirement to seek building regulations approval prior to planning. It's ordinarily done post-planning at that next stage of design where the technical details of the building are worked up in more detail.
And we heard from Councillor Lang, who talked about very much unprecedented in this area, this type of development. It hasn't occurred before, and also there were concerns about the work plan, how the development would be managed in terms of that development.
Yeah, I think it's probably not happened in this street, but obviously Plymouth has a lot of terraced streets with similar style buildings where extensions have been kind of developed in the rear courtyards of those buildings. So I can't see any particular issues around that. There is an informative, I think, around construction management and following that, the guidance in that, and that's generally speaking as far as we can go at the planning stage. Chair.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm grateful for that confirmation. Councillor Finn.
So therefore, if it's under building control, is it fair to say that due consideration will be given to the other property with regard to the foundations? Building control was will specify the depth. It's a metre, whether underpinning needs doing at that stage and would have to be complied with.
Yeah, they will have to, it will require a building regulations application. I'm not a building control surveyor, so the technical details they would need to submit are beyond my ability to answer that. But yeah, the issues that you are talking about would need to be considered at the building regulations stage, the safety of the building, the ventilation, etc.
Thanks, Chair. The bit that's hanging around in my mind is the impact on the historic nature of this bit of Stoke and Plymouth. We are in a conservation area, and I'm quite sure that if exactly the same sort of rear extension was proposed on a modern building or an area that wasn't as unspoilt as the one that we're discussing, then the concerns I have wouldn't be nearly as strong as they are. So it's no criticism of the officer, although it will sound like one. Please believe me, it isn't. That the impact on the historic environment takes up so little room in the report. I mean, you know, there's always a balance of issues, but in terms of how I'm viewing it at the moment, I personally would put a lot more stall on that. I fully take on board the issue that it's at the rear of the property, so anyone walking along Napier Street itself wouldn't see it if the development went ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you, Councillor Stevens. Sorry to interrupt you. Perhaps, Emily, would you mind popping the main planning application image as Councillor Stevens is discussing it, so other members and anyone watching online can see the points that Councillor Stevens is making? Sorry to interrupt you.
No, quite all right, Chair. Very, very helpful. Thank you. I'm just thinking, does the fact that it's not automatically visible to someone walking along the pavement, does that detract from its impact on a historic building and a historic terrace? And I'm not certain in my own mind that concern can be put to one side. So I don't know if Emily or Stuart can sort of expand on that, and I'd be interested in hearing colleagues' thoughts on that subject too.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so as I did mention in the report and in my presentation as well, we did consult with the Historic Environment Officer on this application. I think it is important to mention that the Historic Environment Officer was consulted with these plans, not with construction drawings, as the member of the public did present today at the Planning Committee meeting. And so the information that the Historic Environment Officer has been on the impact of this proposal on the character of the conservation area, and not the impact that the construction of the extension would have on the conservation area, as we aren't able to consider this ourselves as planning officers within the local planning authority. That would be for building control to look into instead. I'm not sure that I came across as I intended to, if given the response. It's I'm not looking at the building control elements now. It is the fact that we do have a very historic, externally, obviously we don't know the internal layout, but externally a rather unspoilt survivor from the 1840s or 1850s. And despite what anyone says, I wasn't on the planning committee when these were first given permission. So I just, clearly if this was going on the front of the property, no doubt Emily and her historic environment colleagues may well come to a very different conclusion, and I'm sure the debate so far would have been extremely different. I'm just thinking at what point does something out of sight that you can't see from the pavement start to impact on the historic nature of the area? I'm not quite sure in my own mind, but I think to give it no consideration would be inappropriate.
Thank you. So there has been consideration. It's clearly made part of the report, and the officers responded to that. So it's not the case that there's been no consideration. There is consideration contained within the report. Councillor Goslin, I have you next on my list, please.
It's just a note. There's been a few comments today about the plans, the construction plans presented by the Member of Public. These are purely speculatory. And are not related to actual building plans submitted. So, we are talking about aspects that, that of the intended construction of this planning application, which we don't know. Many of those concerns could be addressed through proper planning and construction. So, just to draw people's attention to the fact that these are highly conjectural. They're not real.
Absolutely. At the request of the Speaker, permission was granted that could be shown a bit like Councillor Creswell with the prop. Less animated, but nevertheless, permission was granted to the Speaker. But your point is noted. Thank you. Councillor Watkins.
Thank you, Chair. You touched on the fact that there were other properties that have got similar sorts of extensions. Were these actually within the conservation area? Were they historic buildings as well?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so whilst in representations today it's been raised that there may not be an exactly identical example of an extension along Napier Street, within the Stoke Conservation Area, in the local area to Napier Street, there is a lot of evidence of different alterations that have taken place to properties, whether that be rear extensions or other works. As the lead officer has also said, rear extensions of these nature for properties of this design are common within Plymouth and especially within the Stoke Conservation Area, where many properties do have similar architectural merit.
Do they actually join into the wall of the adjoining property, or are they separate? As they were suggesting that if it was pulled back a bit, then it might be acceptable. But are the other ones actually joined in?
I'm afraid I don't have particular examples for different works that have taken place in the surrounding area. I mean, obviously each application is assessed on its own merit, and with what we are able to assess in terms of the visual impact and amenity as has been done with this one, it's not necessarily the case that we would determine an application differently based upon what kind of wall it was built up next to, but I'm afraid I don't have a particular example for you, unfortunately.
Thank you. Councillor Toohey.
Just a couple of points. The first time, I think in the conservation area, it's not part walking down one street and this is okay from the front door. It is a whole area, and you can walk down the alleys and the back, you can look from different houses. It should be a cohesive whole. And in fact, I have to say that in some parts of, in not only Plymouth, walking around and looking back at areas with odd bits of extensions sticking out here and there are extremely ugly, and they spoil it. That's point one. The other thing is that it wasn't in Plymouth, it was in Hampstead, but the houses were of similar age, and they did have an extension on one. I was aware, I knew the family, I knew the people moved in, and exactly the same problems turned up now. This may not be big building regulations as part of this, but from personal experience, the speaker is right, and there was all kinds of damp problems and dry rot in the people who were living there.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Nicholson.
Thank you, Chair. Just one point really for Emily. Apologies if I haven't picked it out, but from a policy perspective, the amount of amenity space outside compared to the size and floor space of the dwelling, does it meet policy? Because generally there's a percentage that you need to ensure you maintain outside space for properties. And I think just one wider point, Chair, I have every sympathy with the Speaker, the representations that are being made. Just to qualify, so it's not a party wall because this is the boundary is wholly within the curtilage of the neighbouring property, in which case how can they facilitate this development if they don't have rights to actually build against the wall? So you might like to clarify that, please.
Thank you. So yeah, in answer to your first question, we do kind of look at the remaining outdoor amenity space when we assess applications like this. It was outlined in the officer report that sufficient outdoor amenity space had been retained. It's difficult to qualify a certain square meterage to what we would say would be acceptable or not in cases like this, as extensions could be constructed under permitted development up to a certain extent that would also reduce the outdoor amenity space. It's considered that, you know, in this case there is still a courtyard left. It hasn't occupied the entire curtilage of the property. In response to your second question about the party wall, so party wall agreements, as far as I know, obviously, as it is not a material planning consideration, my knowledge on them is slightly limited. However, a party wall agreement is needed either when there is a shared party wall, so for example, if two properties both have ownership of that wall. However, another incident where a party wall is needed is where an external wall of the property is proposed to be built up to. The applicant is allowed to build up to their boundary, regardless of kind of what's against it. They just need to go through a party wall agreement in order to kind of confirm these sorts of details that have been raised today. So things like the ventilation, how flashings would attach and things like that. That it can't be kind of assessed as part of a planning application as they're not material. And so those kind of issues would need to be sorted out as part of a party wall agreement instead.
Councillor Stevens.
Chair. I just want to follow up Councillor Tui's point about, which again followed up the point I was trying to make, not as eloquently as Tina did, about what's visible. And I'm looking at the map on page 16, which is quite helpful. The area that we're talking about, although it is in the Stoke Conservation Area, that's a much wider geography. We have this rather special bit of Stoke that's bordered by Exmouth Road to the west, and then Portland Road to the north. Very, very historic buildings. Despite its proximity to the dockyard, an extremely low amount of bomb damage in the Second World War, and a lot of historic survivors that have been wonderfully maintained. So when, Emily, you say there are other examples in the Stoke Conservation Area, how many in this area that I've just described, which is almost what's on the map, in terms of, are there in terms of comparable developments to the one we're looking at?
I wouldn't be able to give an exact number of similar rear extensions in that area.
Thank you. I haven't got any more raised hands. I am going to return to Councillor Partridge because you mooted the idea of perhaps making a suggestion of a motion. I don't know where you are with that.
Thank you, Chair. I haven't heard from members. I think I'm going to keep it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, members. In the absence of any speakers on the panel, may I invite you to vote in respect of this matter. The officer's recommendation is to grant conditionally. I invite you to vote on your panel accordingly. Thank you, members. As the screen illustrated, that's been carried 9 votes for, 1 abstention, 3 against. So thank you very much. Next agenda item is agenda item 7, planning enforcement. I ask committee members to note planning enforcement actions set out at pages 23 and 24 of your bundle. Councillor Stevens.
Thanks. Yeah, not so much the figure work, which I'm sure we're all grateful as we always are. Could I just ask about staffing? Because I understand there's been some changes. So where are we in terms of turnover, experience, lack of experience, etc.? If Stuart could give us a very brief overview, I'm sure we'd all be grateful.
Yeah, happy to. So yeah, unfortunately we did lose Ben Wilcox, who was our senior enforcement officer a short while ago, and we have been out to advert for that post. We haven't been able to fill it on the first round. We will be going out back to advert soon. I mean, planning officers, particularly experienced ones, are in high demand at the moment, and it's a difficult market to be in, but we are hopeful we'll fill Ben's post. In the interim, the 2 area planning managers cover the supervision of the planning enforcement service. So, and I think members will have noticed over previous months that the number of outstanding cases has dramatically come down under their supervision. So they've been doing a sterling job helping the officers to bring that down. And I think we still have 3 officers working on enforcement with a very varied experience. So we're okay.
That's helpful. Could I ask that Stuart keeps us all up to date with the recruitment news, which hopefully will be sooner rather than later, but I'm sure we'd all be grateful to be kept appraised of that. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. Committee to note those enforcement matters. Agenda item number 8, planning applications issued. They're set out at pages 25 to 44. Do members have any questions? Councillor Watkins.
I'm just a bit curious as to why there's 22 applications and 22 refusals for a proposed installation of BT street hubs. I wonder if you could give me some background to that, please.
Yeah, so we received a large number of applications, 32 I think in total, for BT street hubs, which are effectively digital advertising displays that would stand in the street. So there was significant kind of discussion through the course of the application on those, but it was concluded that they would be harmful to the amenity of the street and incongruous in kind of design and appearance in the street as well. So they've been refused on those grounds. I do have one of the decision notices open here. So yeah, it was refused on citing in terms of its impact on pedestrian flow and design also. Obviously each are individual decisions, but that's generally.
Thank you. Members, I invite you to note that. Final agenda item, appeal decisions. I invite committee members to note that. Stuart, did you want to make any comment in respect of those or any questions in respect of those? Thank you very much. Members, thank you very much for your attendance and attention. That concludes our agenda.